which is a rather inconvenient fact since that's Mark Jensen's alibi for about the time that Julie Jensen was murdered on December 3rd, 1998. In the closing argument, defense counsel made much of saying Julie used the internet. Well, of course, here's the problem with that assertion. There is not one whit of evidence in this case that Julie ever used the internet, not one whit. In their opening statement, they said, well, there was internet usage on this date when Mark was at work and Julie was at home. Well, remember Jason Ruff testified about that. No, that actually wasn't internet usage. That was the computer updating itself. There's certain things that update themselves. He said it was something that would take 1 to 2 seconds, and the computer would do that itself. There was simply no evidence that this computer was used when Julie Jensen was home alone. When Mark Jensen was off to his blueprint on November 5th, 6th, and 7th, the computer was not used at all. Now, defense counsel said Julie never told anybody about being sick the weekend that Mark was away at the Blueprint conference. Well, again, sometimes you hear these closing arguments from defense counsel, you wonder if they've been sitting in the same courtroom. Now, acknowledge it's a long trial, but you all saw and heard Ted Voigt's videotape testimony, where Ted Voigt specifically, unequivocally indicated that 2 to 3 weeks before Julie died, she told him that she'd gotten sick. And so she was afraid that Mark was trying to poison her. So she was afraid to eat or drink anything around the house. I'm not making that up. You saw it yourself. You saw it on the screen. Some of you looked at that screen, some of you looked at that screen, but you all saw and heard Ted Voigt testify about Julie being sick 2 or 3 weeks before she died, and how she was afraid to eat or drink anything because she was afraid that Mark was trying to poison her. And by the way, might that explain some weight loss? If you're afraid to eat or drink anything around the house because you're afraid your husband's trying to poison you? There were no searches on the internet for divorce. Well, there are a couple of reasons for that. Number one, Julie didn't use the internet. Number two, she already had a divorce attorney. Remember, she'd filed for divorce in 1990 or 91. I think it was 91. So she already knew who her divorce attorney was going to be. She didn't need to look it up, even if she could, and there's no evidence that she could. But the guy who wanted to run off with his girlfriend on the Windstar cruise, the guy who was having sexual relations with Kelly Labonte, or Kelly Greenman, and then, I think during most of this relationship, when it started in September, she was Kelly Labonte. When it continued by October 1st, she'd just gotten back from her honeymoon. And it started up again. By that time, she was Kelly Greenman. He was having sex with her again. Going off again in the end of October to meet her in Chicago for 4 days. Then she was Kelly Greenman. There was no evidence that Julie Jensen used the internet. And here's the other thing about Julie using the internet. If Julie used the internet, don't you think he'd know about it? If Julie used the computer, don't you think he'd know about it? And if Julie used the computer and he knew about it, do you honestly think he'd have internet exchanges between him and his girlfriend? Let's run off somewhere. Let's do a Windstar cruise. I do love you. I miss you. I want you. Do you think that would be on his home computer if Julie used the computer? Now, defense counsel also said in his closing argument, well, no, we're not saying that Julie was framing Mark for murder while committing suicide. We're just saying she committed suicide. Well, the problem with her just committing suicide is that the evidence is plainly and unequivocally contrary to that. Let's start with what Julie said. Julie was telling her next-door neighbor, her confidant, Ted Voigt. She was telling her third-grade teacher, and she was telling her best friend, Laura Koster, that she was concerned that Mark was trying to kill her, or was trying to poison her, or he was trying to make it look like he was doing that so she'd do something that would make her look crazy. That's what she confided to Ted Voigt. That's what she confided to Laura Koster. That's what she confided to Teresa Fazio. Isn't that kind of inconsistent with a suicide? Now, of course, Dr. West explains everything away because, she had a distorted perception of reality. Well, Dr. West, how do you know she had a distorted perception of reality? Well, because she thought her husband was trying to kill her. Well, doctor, what if he was trying to kill her? Or what if she had reason to believe he was trying to kill her? Well, that was because of her distorted perception of reality. You see the circular reasoning there? Maybe you could see how I was starting to get upset with Dr. West and the nonsense and the BS that she was trying to feed you. So she was looking at the Siggy Caps thing, and there was this major depressive disorder, and the first S in Siggy Caps is for sleep, and the only evidence of sleep disorder comes from Mark Jensen years after Julie's been murdered. Oh, and then what about I? What was the I in Siggy Caps? Anybody remember? It was interest. Julie lost interest. According to Dr. West, who was paid to review this case. Remember, she was paid to do this. She was paid a lot of money to do this. A lot of money. And what did she see about interest? Yeah, well, there was no evidence one way or the other about that. Well, except, of course, you know that's not true. Because you heard testimony from Marion Passetti. You saw her on the television screen. She testified at the last hearing. Remember, she said that Julie called her on November 30th. Julie called Marion Passetti. And what did she call her about? Something about which Julie had a profound level of interest. Gardening. Julie wanted to know what Marion Passetti's information, what Marion Passetti could tell her about how Marion Passetti had such a beautiful garden early in the spring. And so Marion Passetti was telling her all about how you get these seeds in the early winter, and then you get potting soil, and you set it up in your basement, and you get sun lamps, or these black lamps that provide sunlight, and you start your garden in the basement. So Julie was asking Marion Passetti very detailed questions about this. Marion Passetti said that conversation lasted 20 minutes to a half hour on November 30th, 1998, the day before Julie went to see Dr. Borman. So the day before Julie went to see Dr. Mormon, and 4 days before she was dead, Julie Jensen was talking with her friend, her neighbor, about having a detailed conversation about setting up her winter garden so that she could have early spring garden. But Dr. West didn't see anything significant. She didn't know about that, apparently. And if she had, well, of course, Dr. West could explain away anything that was inconsistent with suicidal intent, because under suicidality, she had admitted there was no evidence of suicidality. She admitted that. Julie never told anybody she was going to commit suicide. Julie had never attempted suicide. Julie had never made any plan for suicide. Any plan for her two boys that were everything to her. Her plan, apparently the defense theory is that Julie's plan was she'd leave the children in the care of the man who she believed was trying to kill her or make her look crazy. Julie had no suicide plan. She had never attempted suicide. She never talked about suicide to anybody at all. Mark Jensen also talked to Paul Griffin. And again, remember, we're talking about blending fact with fiction? Well, I shouldn't say we're talking about. Mr. Perry talked about blending fact with fiction. And if you look at the lead up to the point where Mark Jensen was charged with first-degree murder, that's what he was doing with everybody he talked to outside the family. When he was talking with Paul Griffin on February 24th, 2000, this is Mark said about December 2nd. Right. The night before, the night before was when I think, if I remember it, it was the night we had macaroni and cheese, and we made that, and I botched that real good, and she wasn't even awake much. I mean, she was in bed the whole time. She was sleeping most of the time. I think the kids were being quiet not to wake her. I mean, there was some conversation that night, but she was pretty much out of it. That was Mark Jensen's description to Paul Griffin of Julie Jensen on about her condition on December 2nd. And he said that on February 24th, 2000. And then what did Mark Jensen say in his blending fact with fiction about December 3rd? He told Ratsburg, David stated he observed his mother breathing very heavily and had labored breathing the morning before her death. David stated he told several friends about this as well. David asked his dad the morning of December 3rd if his mother needed to go to the hospital. His dad said no. However, if she was worse later in the day, they would take her to the hospital. David said it was too late as they returned home and they found her dead. David said his mother was not eating, however, she was drinking a lot of water. And then the defendant's interview, page 71. She couldn't get out of bed that morning. You can ask David. She couldn't get out of bed. He wanted to stay home because Mom was sick. She was in bed asleep. And then page 82. There was a question between myself and the kids that morning whether or not to call an ambulance, take her to the hospital, and the kids wanted to stay home. Her breathing was funny. She could hardly get out of bed. I mean, it was a god-awful situation. The bruising probably came from her getting up. I didn't hit her. She got up and she fell. She hit her head. I remember her telling me that. She got up to go to the John. And then at page 89, from 6:30 in the morning, she was not able to get out of bed. I mean, she was groggy, almost incoherent. Breathing was very labored, raspy. David tells me we talked about it. David tells me that I was holding her up, supporting her. Page 119. He had to bring her water. She couldn't even go to the John. David said she couldn't talk that morning. Page 138. She didn't get out of bed. She had a hard time breathing and could barely move on her own from 6:30 on. Blending fact with fiction. The fact that Mark Jensen knew he had to disclose because David was right there with him for this April 29th interview. And then the phone call that Mark Jensen had with Paul Griffin on January 9th, 2000. Mark, I didn't even hear her talk Thursday. How to describe it, to have it make sense to you. Her breathing was labored, kind of wheezy. She was cognizant of what you were telling her. She was weak by Thursday. I doubt she could have, if she could have got out of bed, it would have been crawling. Blending fact with fiction on April 21st, 1999, before Mark Jensen knew that we had computer evidence that we recovered from his computer, establishing that at 9:42 a.m. on December 3rd, 1998, somebody was looking up the late stages of ethylene glycol poisoning, unconsciousness, loss of consciousness, so forth. How to explain that? How to explain that when she couldn't get out of bed? Well, there is no explanation for it. That's consistent with the defendant's innocence. The only explanation for that is Mark Jensen was continually upset that Julie wasn't dying quickly enough. Here he gave her this antifreeze on the evening of December 1st. He was hoping she'd be dead by the morning of December 2nd, and there she was still alive. And he woke her up, and he was saying, or she woke him up, and she was dizzy and drunk. She said feeling drunk, and she needed an explanation for that. So he needed something to cause her to sleep through the poisoning. And so he went to see the doctor on December 2nd. And Julie thought, we know this because Julie talked to Margaret Voigt. Julie called her friend Margaret Voigt on the morning of December 2nd. And Julie was happier than she'd been in weeks or months. Here she was desperately sick, desperately ill, very uncomfortable. Very, very uncomfortable. But she was happy because Mark was taking care of her. Mark was being good to her. Mark got the boys off to school. Julie was finally getting what she'd been looking for. She was getting a supportive spouse instead of the sadistic, narcissistic thug that she was actually married to. She thought Mark loved her. And when Mark got back from the doctor, he showed again how much he loved her by giving her the Ambien pill that the doctor had prescribed for her, and giving her another half a dose of paroxetine, and, helping her wash it down with orange juice and antifreeze. What a loving husband. Didn't she have reason to be happy on December 2nd, 1998 at 10 a.m.? She'd been lulled into believing that this monster that she was married to was finally showing her a little bit of love. That's what the evidence showed in this case, ladies and gentlemen. And he's guilty. Thank you.